The Nevada sun was setting when Staff Sergeant James Mitchell's black Ford F-150 pulled into the gravel parking lot of Pete's Roadside Cafe. The small restaurant sat alone on Highway 95, a beacon for tired travelers with its neon OPN sign flickering against the darkening desert sky. James had been driving for 6 hours straight, making his way back to base after an intensive 3-week training exercise at Fort Irwin. At 32 years old, James didn't look like your typical soldier. While his military-issued haircut and the dog tags around his neck gave away his profession, there was something else about him, a quiet confidence that came from 10 years of Special Forces experience and 3 tours in Afghanistan. His face carried the weathered look of someone who had seen more than most, yet his dark brown eyes remained alert despite his exhaustion. Pete's Roadside Cafe wasn't much to look at from the outside. The white paint was peeling, and the window frames needed fixing, but James had stopped here before. He knew that Pete, the 65-year-old owner, served the best coffee and hamburgers for 50 miles in any direction. More importantly, it was usually quiet, perfect for a man who just wanted to eat in peace. The bell above the door chimed as James entered, still wearing his fatigues from the long drive. The familiar smell of coffee and grilled onions filled his nostrils. Only 4 other customers occupied the red vinyl booths. An elderly couple sharing a slice of pie, and 2 truck drivers hunched over their plates at the counter. "Well, look who it is," Pete's friendly voice called out from behind the counter. The old man's white hair was messy as usual, and his apron had seen better days, but his smile was genuine. "Haven't seen you in a while, Sergeant." James nodded respectfully, choosing a booth near the back where he could see both the entrance and the parking lot, a habit he'd never managed to break since his first deployment. "Been busy with training, Pete. Good to be back." Sarah, the only waitress working the evening shift, brought him a menu and a glass of water. She was Pete's granddaughter, working part-time while studying at the local community college. "The usual, Sergeant Mitchell?" she asked, already knowing his order by heart. "Yes, ma'am. Double cheeseburger, extra fries, and keep the coffee coming." James managed a tired smile. The training exercise had been particularly grueling this time, with his unit practicing complex extraction scenarios in the desert heat. As Sarah walked away with his order, James took a moment to check his phone. 3 missed calls from his sister in Ohio, probably wanting to know when he'd visit next. He made a mental note to call her back once he got to base. Their parents passing 5 years ago had brought them closer, and she worried about him constantly. The cafe's radio played old country songs softly in the background, and the gentle clinking of dishes from the kitchen created a peaceful atmosphere. James could feel some of the tension from the past weeks starting to ease from his shoulders. The elderly couple paid their bill and left, leaving just him and the truck drivers in the dining area. Pete brought over his coffee personally, steam rising from the white ceramic mug. "Rough few weeks?" the old man asked, noting the dark circles under James's eyes. "Nothing I can't handle," James replied, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Just need some good food and a real bed tonight." Pete nodded understandingly. He'd served in Vietnam himself, which was one of the reasons he always had a soft spot for military personnel who stopped at his cafe. "Food's coming right up, on the house tonight." James started to protest, but Pete waved him off. "Don't argue with an old man in his own restaurant, Sergeant." The moment of friendly conversation was interrupted by the distant rumble of motorcycles growing louder. Through the window, James could see multiple headlights approaching. The sound grew to a roar as several bikes pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts reflecting the cafe's neon lights. Pete's expression changed slightly as he glanced out the window. "Excuse me," he said quietly, returning to his place behind the counter. James noticed the old man's shoulders tense up as the bell above the door prepared to welcome new customers. Something in Pete's reaction made James sit up straighter, his military instincts kicking in. The peaceful evening at Pete's Roadside Cafe was about to become anything but quiet. The bell above the door chimed aggressively as 7 bikers stomped into Pete's Roadside Cafe. The smell of leather, cigarettes, and stale beer followed them inside. Their heavy boots echoed against the linoleum floor as they made their way to the largest booth, deliberately scraping chairs and making as much noise as possible. The 2 truck drivers at the counter quickly paid their bills and left, exchanging knowing looks as they hurried out. Sarah, who had been carrying James's order from the kitchen, paused momentarily before setting his plate down. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the double cheeseburger and fries on his table. "Let me know if you need anything else," she whispered, before quickly retreating behind the counter near her grandfather. The bikers were a rough-looking bunch. Their leader, who went by the name Snake, was a tall man with a shaggy gray beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. His leather vest displayed the patches of their motorcycle club, Desert Wolves, along with various other emblems that spoke of a questionable past. "Hey, sweetheart," Snake called out to Sarah, his voice carrying an edge that made James's jaw tighten. "7 beers and make it quick." Pete stepped forward, his voice firm despite his obvious concern. "You know the rules, Snake. No alcohol served after 8 p.m. on weekdays." Snake's face darkened as he looked at his watch. It was 8:15 p.m. "Since when do you follow rules so strictly, old man?" He glanced around the nearly empty cafe until his bloodshot eyes landed on James, still quietly eating his meal. "Oh, I get it. Got ourselves a soldier boy here, so you're playing it straight." The other bikers snickered, their attention now focused on James. They were already intoxicated from wherever they'd been before, their movements unsteady, and their voices too loud for the small space. "Hey, Jarhead," called out one of the younger bikers, a skinny man with a bandana wrapped around his head. "This ain't the army mess hall. Why don't you take your business elsewhere?" James continued eating, methodically cutting his burger into quarters the way he always did. He dealt with similar situations before and knew that engaging would only escalate things. His training had taught him that the best fight was the one you could avoid. Snake, apparently irritated by James's lack of response, stood up and walked over to his booth. The biker's heavy silver rings clicked against the table as he leaned down, deliberately invading James's personal space. "I'm talking to you, soldier boy. You deaf or just stupid?" Sarah gasped from behind the counter as Snake reached for James's coffee mug. Pete took a step forward, but froze when 2 other bikers stood up, blocking his path. "Look," James said calmly, finally looking up at Snake. "I'm just here to eat my dinner. I don't want any trouble." Snake's lip curled into a sneer. "Well, that's too bad, 'cause trouble just found you." He picked up James's coffee mug and took a long, deliberate sip before spitting the coffee back into the cup. "Coffee's cold anyway." The other bikers laughed, creating a chorus of harsh sounds that filled the small cafe. Pete had managed to quietly reach for the phone behind the counter, his fingers hovering over the keypad. James slowly put down his fork and knife, his movements deliberate and controlled. He could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline beginning to course through his veins, but his special forces training kept his breathing steady and his mind clear. "Last chance," James said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent cafe. "Walk away, and we can all finish our evening in peace." Snake's face reddened with anger. Nobody had stood up to him in this town for years, and he wasn't about to let some soldier change that. He reached down and grabbed James's plate, preparing to dump it in his lap. The atmosphere in Pete's Roadside cafe had become electric with tension. Sarah had her hand over her mouth. Pete was mid-dial on the phone, and the remaining customers pressed themselves against the walls, unsure of what was about to unfold. What none of the bikers knew was that Staff Sergeant James Mitchell wasn't just any soldier. He was about to teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Time seemed to slow down as Snake tilted James's plate, the double cheeseburger sliding toward the edge. But before the food could fall, James's hand shot out with lightning speed, catching the plate and setting it smoothly on the table. His movements were so quick and precise that Snake blinked in surprise, momentarily thrown off balance. "That's some fancy reflexes you got there, soldier boy," Snake growled, trying to hide his astonishment. The biker stepped back slightly, reassessing the situation. Something about James's calm demeanor and lightning-fast movements had triggered a warning bell in his alcohol-clouded mind. 2 of the younger bikers, who had been watching from their booth, exchanged uncertain glances. They had joined the Desert Wolves just 6 months ago, attracted by the lifestyle and the promise of brotherhood. But this situation felt different from their usual intimidation tactics. Pete had finished dialing 911 behind the counter, speaking in hushed tones to the dispatcher. Sarah stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tight her knuckles had turned white. The cafe's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating an eerie backdrop to the tense standoff. "You know what I think?" Snake continued, his voice getting louder as he tried to regain control of the situation. "I think you military types think you're better than everyone else, walking around in your fancy uniforms, expecting special treatment." James remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert. His years of combat experience had taught him to read situations and people. He could see that Snake was the real threat. The others were just following his lead. The two younger bikers near the door were already showing signs of wanting to leave, while the three others were spread out across the cafe, trying to look tough but keeping their distance. "No one here thinks they're better than anyone else," James replied evenly. "I'm just a customer trying to enjoy a meal, same as you." Snake's face twisted with anger at James's continued composure. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a switchblade, the metal catching the light as the blade snapped open. The sound echoed through the quiet cafe like a gunshot. "Drop the knife, Snake," Pete shouted from behind the counter, his voice stronger than anyone expected. "Police are already on their way." But Snake was too far gone, his judgment clouded by alcohol and wounded pride. He pointed the blade at James, who hadn't moved from his seat. "Let's see how tough you are now, soldier boy." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they had signed up for. Harassing locals and causing minor trouble was one thing, but pulling a knife on a soldier was crossing a line even they weren't comfortable with. "Boss, maybe we should go," one of the younger bikers suggested nervously. "Cops'll be here soon." James watched as Snake's attention briefly shifted to his worried companion. In that split second, the soldier made his assessment. Snake's stance was unbalanced, his grip on the knife amateur at best. The alcohol in his system had slowed his reactions, and his anger made him predictable. "Last warning," James said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had faced far worse threats than a drunk biker with a switchblade. "Put the knife away, and we can all walk away from this." Snake's response was to lunge forward, slashing the knife in a wild arc toward James's face. But James was no longer in his seat. In one fluid motion, he had slipped out of the booth and to the side, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had trained for exactly these kinds of situations. The cafe erupted into chaos. Sarah screamed, Pete shouted, and the other bikers backed away, creating space for what was about to unfold. The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, but they were still minutes away. Snake spun around, surprised to find his target wasn't where he expected. His face contorted with rage as he realized he had missed completely. The biker leader raised the knife again, but this time, James Mitchell wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. The real fight was about to begin, and Snake was about to learn why picking a fight with a Special Forces soldier had been the worst decision of his life. What happened next was so fast that most of the onlookers could barely follow the movements. James moved with the fluid precision that came from years of combat training, his body operating on pure muscle memory and instinct. As Snake lunged forward with the knife again, James stepped into the attack rather than away from it, a move that surprised everyone, especially Snake. In one swift motion, James caught Snake's knife hand at the wrist, using the biker's own momentum against him. His other hand shot up to Snake's elbow, creating a perfect arm lock that made the biker howl in pain. The switchblade clattered to the floor as Snake's fingers involuntarily released their grip. Before anyone could react, James had kicked the weapon under a nearby booth, well out of reach. "That's enough," one of the older bikers shouted, rushing forward to help his leader. He was a heavy-set man with a thick beard and brass knuckles already slipped onto his right hand. James released Snake with a controlled push that sent him stumbling into a table, then turned to face the new threat. The biker swung his brass-knuckled fist in a wide arc, but James had already moved. He ducked under the punch and delivered two lightning-fast strikes, one to the solar plexus and another to the throat. The big biker dropped to his knees, gasping for air. Snake had recovered his balance and was now circling James, his face red with rage and embarrassment. Two more bikers joined him, creating a triangle around the soldier. Sarah watched in horror from behind the counter, while Pete continued updating the 911 dispatcher about the escalating situation. 3 against 1, James said calmly, turning slowly to keep all 3 men in his sight. Is that how the desert wolves handle their business? The 3 men attacked simultaneously. Snake came in, though, trying to tackle James's legs. Another biker swung a heavy chain, while the third pulled out brass knuckles similar to his fallen companions. James moved like water. He sidestepped Snake's tackle, causing the biker leader to crash into one of his own men. The chain wielder's weapon whistled through empty air as James closed the distance between them. In one smooth motion, James trapped the chain against the biker's body and used it to swing him into the man with brass knuckles. The impact sent both men crashing into a booth, splintering the wooden table. Snake scrambled to his feet, only to meet James's fist in a perfectly executed strike that broke his nose with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across Snake's leather vest as he stumbled backward, hands clutching his face. "You broke my nose," he screamed, his voice muffled and nasal. "Be thankful that's all I broke," James replied, his stance still ready for any further attacks. The two younger bikers who had been hanging back finally made their decision. They turned and ran out of the cafe, the bell jingling wildly as they fled into the night. The sound of motorcycle engines roaring to life could be heard moments later as they abandoned their companions. The remaining bikers were in various states of disarray. The big man was still on his knees, struggling to breathe normally. The two who had been thrown into the booth were groaning, tangled in broken wood and upholstery. Snake stood swaying, blood streaming between his fingers as he held his broken nose. Red and blue lights began flashing through the cafe windows as police cars finally pulled into the parking lot. The approaching sirens had been growing louder, but everyone had been too focused on the fight to notice. "It's over," James announced, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Stay down and wait for the police." Pete emerged from behind the counter, a baseball bat in his hands that he hadn't needed to use. Sarah was already pulling out the first aid kit, though she kept a safe distance from the fallen bikers. The entire fight had lasted less than 2 minutes. James stood in the center of the cafe, his breathing barely elevated. His military training had taken over, allowing him to neutralize multiple threats without causing any permanent damage, though Snake's nose might disagree with that assessment. As police officers burst through the door with weapons drawn, James slowly raised his hands and prepared to explain how a quiet evening at Pete's Roadside Cafe had turned into something that the local police department would be talking about for years to come. 4 police cars had surrounded Pete's Roadside Cafe, their emergency lights painting the desert night in alternating red and blue. Inside, officers Mike Thompson and Sarah Rodriguez, who had arrived first on the scene, were taking in the aftermath of the fight. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," Officer Thompson commanded, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he surveyed the scene. Broken furniture littered the floor, and 5 bikers were scattered around the cafe in various states of defeat. James maintained his calm position, hands raised. "Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, U.S. Army Special Forces," he announced clearly. "I have military ID in my back pocket." Officer Rodriguez approached him cautiously while her partner kept watch. After carefully retrieving and checking his identification, her posture relaxed slightly. "Want to tell me what happened here, Sergeant?" Pete stepped forward, still gripping his baseball bat. "I called 911 officers. I saw the whole thing. These men," he gestured to the bikers, "came in looking for trouble. Their leader pulled a knife on Sergeant Mitchell. Everything he did was self-defense." Sarah nodded vigorously from behind the counter. "I saw it too. The bikers started it. They were drunk and threatening everyone." Snake pulled the knife first. She pointed to where the switchblade still lay under the booth. More officers entered the cafe, and the scene quickly transformed into a flurry of activity. EMTs were called to check on the injured bikers, while evidence technicians photographed the scene and collected the knife. Snake, still holding his bleeding nose, tried to tell a different story. "He attacked us. We were just having a peaceful dinner." "Save it, Snake," Officer Thompson interrupted. "We've got security footage." He pointed to the camera in the corner of the cafe. "Pete installed those last month after your gang's last visit. This time everything's on video." Snake's face fell as he realized his usual intimidation tactics wouldn't work. The EMTs were checking his nose, confirming it was indeed broken but clean break that would heal. Detective Lisa Martinez arrived 20 minutes later. As the lead investigator for the county's gang task force, she had been tracking the Desert Wolves for months. She listened to James' account of the events with growing interest. "So you disarmed him without seriously injuring anyone?" she asked, impressed. "Most people would have just tried to run." James shrugged modestly. "My training emphasizes minimum necessary force. Nobody needed to die tonight over a cup of coffee and some wounded pride. The detective smiled as she made notes in her notebook. Well, Sergeant, you might have done us a favor. We've been building a case against the Desert Wolves for months. This incident, combined with the security footage, gives us enough to bring charges against several members. Outside the cafe, two of the bikers were already in handcuffs, being read their rights as officers discovered outstanding warrants during routine checks. Snake was handcuffed to his hospital gurney, preparing for a trip to the emergency room before booking. Pete was talking with his insurance agent on the phone, but he didn't seem too worried about the damaged furniture. Several customers who had heard about the excitement had started arriving, ordering coffee and asking for details about what happened. Sarah brought James a fresh cup of coffee and a new burger to replace his interrupted meal. On the house, she insisted. And probably free coffee for life, if Grandpa has anything to say about it. James accepted the food gratefully, realizing he was still hungry despite all the excitement. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him even more tired than before. Detective Martinez finished her interview and handed James her card. We'll need you to come by the station tomorrow to sign your formal statement, but you're free to go for now. Good work, Sergeant. Though I hope you don't make a habit of cleaning up our county's criminal problems. As things settled down, customers who had gathered outside began filtering in, drawn by the excitement and police presence. The story was already growing as it spread through the small town's gossip network. Pete's Roadside Cafe, usually quiet this time of night, was now buzzing with energy as locals arrived to see the aftermath of the soldier who had single-handedly taken down 5 members of the Desert Wolves. James just wanted to finish his meal and get back to base, but he knew this night would become local legend. Sometimes, he reflected, a quiet dinner was too much to ask for. The next morning, Pete's Roadside Cafe was already packed by 7 a.m. News of the previous night's events had spread like wildfire through the small desert community. Every local who stopped by had their own version of the story to share, each telling growing slightly more dramatic than the last. James arrived at the cafe before heading to the police station, having gotten minimal sleep at the base. He was surprised to find his picture already taped to the wall behind the counter, right next to Pete's old Vietnam service photo. The image showed him helping the EMTs tend to Snake's broken nose. Someone had captured it on their phone during the chaos. There he is. Pete called out as James entered. The old man was beaming with pride, as if James was his own son. Several customers turned to stare, and a few even applauded. James felt his face flush with embarrassment. He hadn't expected to become a local celebrity. Just here for some coffee before heading to the station, James said quietly, trying to find a seat at the counter away from the attention. But Pete was already pulling out his special mug, one reserved for veterans, and filling it with fresh coffee. Sarah appeared with a plate of eggs and bacon. You need a good breakfast before dealing with all that paperwork, she insisted. Her grandfather had given her the day off to recover from the excitement, but she had come in anyway, knowing James would likely stop by. As James ate, he couldn't help overhearing the conversations around him. One elderly man was telling his wife how James had fought off 12 bikers. The number kept growing with each retelling. Another customer swore he had a cousin in the Special Forces who knew James personally and had witnessed him take down an entire terrorist cell single-handedly. Detective Martinez arrived around 8 a.m., carrying a thick folder of paperwork. She chose to sit next to James at the counter, ordering her own coffee as she spread out the documents. You've become quite the local hero, she said with a smile, sliding several forms toward him. The security footage is even better than we hoped. Clear shots of Snake pulling the knife, everything. James nodded, reviewing the paperwork carefully. What's going to happen to them? Snake's looking at serious time, Martinez explained. Assault with a deadly weapon, plus we found drugs in his saddlebags. The others will face various charges too. But here's the interesting part. 2 of them are willing to turn state's evidence about some of the Desert Wolves' other activities. Pete refilled their coffee cups, unable to resist adding his own thoughts. Those wolves have been terrorizing local businesses for years. Nobody ever stood up to them before. That's about to change, Martinez assured him. We're coordinating with federal authorities now. Looks like the wolves were involved in a lot more than just local intimidation. As James signed the last of his statements, more customers filtered in. A young boy, probably around 10, cautiously approached with a napkin and pen in hand. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said nervously. "Would you sign this? I want to join the army when I grow up." James looked at the boy thoughtfully, then took the napkin. Instead of just signing his name, he wrote, "Remember, real strength isn't about fighting. It's about protecting others. Study hard and stay true to what's right. Staff Sergeant J. Mitchell." The boy's face lit up as he read the message, clutching the napkin carefully before running back to show his parents. Detective Martinez gathered her paperwork, looking amused. "You know, some of my officers are already calling this place the Last Stand Cafe now." Pete overheard this and stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Has a nice ring to it, actually. Might have to get a new sign made." James finished his coffee and prepared to leave, but Pete stopped him. "Hold on a second." The old man disappeared into the back room and returned with something in his hands, a coffee mug, brand new, with reserve for SGT. Mitchell, hand-painted on the side. "For whenever you're passing through," Pete said proudly. "Which I hope will be often. This place feels safer with you around." James accepted the mug, touched by the gesture. As he walked out to his truck, he could see Pete already on the phone with a sign maker, while Sarah added his coffee mug to a special shelf behind the counter. What had started as a simple stop for dinner had transformed into something much more significant, not just for James, but for the entire community. Sometimes, he realized, the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but in small roadside cafes where someone simply decides to stand up for what's right. A month had passed since the incident at Pete's Roadside Cafe, now unofficially known as the Last Stand Cafe among locals. The desert wolves had all but disappeared from the county, their influence crumbling after that fateful night. Detective Martinez's investigation, helped by the two members who had turned state's evidence, had led to multiple arrests and the discovery of several illegal operations. James had tried to keep a low profile, focusing on his duties at the base, but his reputation had grown despite his best efforts. Every time he stopped at the cafe, which was at least once a week now, someone would want to shake his hand or thank him for making the community safer. On this particular evening, James pulled into the cafe's parking lot to find it unusually busy. Pete had strung up lights outside, and a hand-painted banner read Community Appreciation Night. As James walked in, he immediately noticed the changes inside too. The broken furniture had been replaced with new, sturdier pieces, and the walls had been freshly painted. "There's our guest of honor," Pete called out as James entered. The cafe was packed with familiar faces, regular customers, local business owners, and even a few police officers, including Detective Martinez. Sarah hurried over, wearing a new uniform with the cafe's unofficial new name embroidered on it. "Surprise," she said, grinning. "Grandpa's been planning this for weeks. He wanted to thank you properly." James looked around, somewhat overwhelmed. The cafe had been transformed. New security cameras were visible in each corner, though they seemed unnecessary now. The counter had been extended, and behind it hung a large framed photo of the cafe's history, including a newspaper clipping about the night of the fight. Pete made his way through the crowd, looking prouder than ever. "Come on, son, there's something you need to see." He led James to a special corner of the cafe where a new installation caught everyone's attention. It was a wall of protectors, featuring photographs of local service members, police officers, and first responders. In the center was the photo of James helping the EMTs, but now it was professionally framed alongside his military service details. "This community needed a reminder of the good people who keep us safe," Pete explained. "You inspired this. Since that night, 3 more young people from town have enlisted in the military, and applications to the police academy have doubled." Detective Martinez approached, carrying a folder. "And that's not all," she added. "Remember those 2 wolves who turned evidence? They're both entering rehabilitation programs. One's even talking about joining the army once he's clean. Said something about wanting to use his strength the right way." James stood quietly, taking it all in. He hadn't intended to become a symbol or inspire anyone. He just wanted to eat his dinner in peace that night. But sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest ripples. Sarah's voice came over the cafe's speaker system. "Everyone, can I have your attention, please?" The crowd quieted down. A month ago, this was just another quiet truck stop cafe. But thanks to one person's courage to stand up against bullies, it's become something more. It's become a symbol of what happens when good people refuse to look the other way. Pete stepped forward, holding something covered in cloth. "Sergeant Mitchell, we had this made special." He unveiled a new plaque that would hang by the entrance. It read, "All are welcome here, where courage meets kindness. Established 1975, reborn 2025. The crowd applauded as Pete hummed the plaque. James noticed that several of the older customers had tears in their eyes. They had lived with the fear of the desert wolves for so long that this symbol of change meant more to them than he could have imagined. Detective Martinez touched his arm gently. "You know, sometimes it just takes one person to show others that change is possible. The wolves thought they were powerful because they made people afraid. You showed everyone that real strength comes from protecting others." As the evening continued, James sat at his usual spot at the counter, drinking from his special mug. He watched as people shared stories, laughed, and simply enjoyed feeling safe in their community. Children played freely near the entrance, no longer hurried inside by worried parents when motorcycles passed by. The cafe had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a symbol of community strength and resilience. And it all started because one soldier, tired from a long drive, simply wanted to enjoy his dinner in peace. 1 year after the incident that changed Pete's Roadside Cafe forever, James Mitchell sat in his usual spot, drinking coffee from his personal mug. The cafe had transformed remarkably over the past 12 months. What was once a quiet truck stop had become a popular local landmark, drawing visitors from neighboring counties who wanted to see where the famous Last Stand took place. Pete had embraced the change while keeping the cafe's heart intact. The walls now displayed an even larger collection of military and first responder photos, each telling its own story of service and sacrifice. But it was more than just decoration. It had become a gathering place for veterans, a safe haven where they could find understanding and support. Sarah, now the cafe's manager while still pursuing her degree, had started a monthly support group for veterans that met in the newly added back room. James often attended, sharing his experiences and helping others navigate the challenges of post-service life. "You know what today is, right?" Sarah asked as she refilled James's coffee cup. Her engagement ring caught the light. She was now engaged to one of the young officers who had responded to the scene that night. James nodded. "Hard to forget. Snake gets out of prison today." Pete, overhearing from behind the counter, came over. "Heard he's not the same man who went in," the old man said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Martinez told me he completed every rehabilitation program they offered, even got his GED." As if on cue, Detective Martinez walked through the door. She was now the county's chief of police, her investigation into the desert wolves having led to one of the largest criminal busts in the state's history. "Thought I'd find you here," she said, sliding onto the stool next to James. "Just came from the prison. Snake asked me to deliver something." She pulled out an envelope and handed it to James. Inside was a letter, written in careful handwriting. "Sergeant Mitchell. A year ago, I was a different person. I thought strength meant making others fear me. You showed me what real strength looks like. In prison, I've had time to think about the man I was and the man I want to be. I'm sorry for what happened that night. Thank you for breaking my nose, but not my spirit. Thomas, formerly Snake Reynolds." James folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. The cafe had grown quiet as regular customers, sensing the significance of the moment, watched discreetly. "He's moving to Arizona," Martinez added. "Wants a fresh start. Says he's going to work with at-risk youth, show them there's a better path than the one he chose." Pete nodded approvingly. Redemption's a powerful thing. Speaking of which, he gestured to the window, where a military recruitment vehicle had just pulled into the parking lot. The recruiting officer, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, was a regular now. She set up at a corner table once a month, talking to young people interested in military service. Several local kids had already enlisted, inspired by the story they'd grown up hearing about the soldier who stood up to the desert wolves. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, James looked around at what this simple act of standing up to police had created. The cafe's new slogan, painted above the counter, read, "Where every stand makes a difference." Pete's granddaughter came out of the kitchen carrying a special cake decorated with an American flag. "Happy anniversary," she announced, setting it on the counter, "to the night that changed everything." Customers gathered around, sharing pieces of cake and swapping their own versions of the story. Some of the details had grown exaggerated over time, Some versions now had James fighting off 20 bikers blindfolded, but the core message remained the same. One person's courage can transform a community. As James prepared to leave for his evening duties at the base, Pete stopped him one last time. You know, son, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. You could walked away that night. Could look the other way like everyone else did for years. But you didn't. James smiled, touching the frame of his photo on the wall of protectors. I just wanted some coffee and a burger, he said with a quiet laugh. Well, Pete replied, you got your coffee and burger, and we all got something much more valuable. We got our community back. As James drove away from Pete's roadside cafe that evening, he could see the sunset painting the desert sky in brilliant colors. The cafe's neon sign glowed warmly in his rearview mirror, a beacon of hope and courage in the growing darkness, reminding everyone that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with fists, but with the simple courage to stand up for what's right. The end.